The wooden bucket slipped from her trembling fingers, cold water splashing across the worn floorboards of the cabin she could no longer call home. Brielle Wolfsong stood frozen in the dim light filtering through cracked shutters, her white hair clinging to her pale cheeks, her red dress soaked and heavy against her thin frame. The fabric clung to her skin, making her shiver in the autumn chill that crept through every crack in the walls. "You worthless creature." Her stepmother's voice cut through the air like shattered glass, each word a blade designed to carve away what little remained of Brielle's spirit. "Can you do nothing right? Pick it up, clean it, and when you're done, scrub the floors again. All of them. And this time, use the brush, not the cloth. I want to see your knees bleed." The last part was said with such casual cruelty that it barely registered anymore. Pain had become Brielle's constant companion, as familiar as her own reflection. She had learned to welcome it, almost. Because at least pain meant she was still alive. Still feeling, still somehow surviving in this nightmare that had become her existence. Brielle dropped to her knees, her hands raw and bleeding from the day's labor, from the week's labor, from the months and years of endless, thankless work. She was 18 years old, an omega in a world that had forgotten her worth, forgotten her name, forgotten that she was anything more than a servant in her own family's home. Her father had died 3 winters ago, succumbing to a fever that had ravaged him for weeks while she sat helplessly by his bedside, holding his hand as the light faded from his eyes. With her father's death had died any semblance of love or protection. The man who had called her his little moon, who had braided her white hair and told her stories of the ancient wolves who ran beneath silver skies, was gone. And in his place came the vultures. Her stepmother, Morgana, had moved in within a month of the funeral, bringing her 2 daughters, Celeste and Vivienne. They were cruel in the way that only those born into privilege could be, their cruelty refined and deliberate, designed to break rather than merely hurt. They took Brielle's room, gave her a corner in the attic that leaked when it rained. They took her clothes, leaving her with only the red dress her father had given her on her 16th birthday, a dress now faded and torn. They took her name from conversations, referring to her only as girl or creature or, most often, nothing at all. Brielle had become invisible, a shadow that cooked and cleaned and suffered in silence. She woke before dawn to light the fires, to prepare breakfast for a family that barely acknowledged her existence. She scrubbed floors until her knuckles split open. She mended clothes by candlelight until her eyes burned and watered. She ate scraps, if there were any left, and slept on a thin blanket that did nothing to keep out the cold. And through it all, she endured. Because what else could she do? She was an omega with no pack, no family, no one to turn to. The village had forgotten her, too absorbed in their own struggles to notice the white-haired girl who disappeared a little more each day. The bucket. Now. Her stepsister Celeste laughed from the doorway, arms crossed over her expensive silk dress, eyes glittering with a malice that seemed to feed on Brielle's suffering. Or maybe you'd prefer to sleep outside with the dogs tonight. I hear it's going to snow. Wouldn't that be lovely? You and the mongrels, huddled together for warmth. Vivienne joined in, her voice a mockery of sweetness. Oh, but Celeste. The dogs might object. They have standards after all. The 2 sisters dissolved into laughter, the sound grating and sharp, echoing off the walls of the small cabin. Morgana watched from her chair by the fire, a thin smile playing at her lips, saying nothing but approving everything with her silence. Before we continue with the story, tell us where you're watching from and how old you are. I hope you enjoy the story. The bucket. Now. Her stepsister laughed from the doorway, arms crossed, eyes glittering with cruelty. Or maybe you'd prefer to sleep outside with the dogs tonight. The words didn't even sting anymore. Brielle had learned to swallow pain the way others swallowed air, necessary and constant and suffocating. She had learned to make herself small, to disappear into the background, to become less than human, so that perhaps they would forget she existed and leave her alone. She reached for the bucket with trembling fingers, her whole body aching with exhaustion that went bone deep, that seemed to have seeped into her very soul. But then the door exploded open. Not the door she was kneeling beside, the one that led to the kitchen where she would spend the next hour scrubbing pots with frozen water. The front door, the one that faced the forest road where no one ever came, where nothing ever changed, where the world had seemingly forgotten this small cabin existed. It flew open with such force that the hinges screamed in protest, tearing partially from the rotted wood frame, and cold wind rushed in like a living thing, carrying with it the scent of pine and smoke and winter and something wild, something ancient, something primal that made every wolf in the village lift their heads and howl in recognition and submission. The temperature in the room dropped instantly. Frost spread across the windows in delicate patterns. The fire in the hearth guttered and nearly died, as if afraid of what was coming. A man stood in the doorway. No, not a man. A king. An alpha. A force of nature barely contained in human form. Igor Grimwolf filled the frame like a storm made flesh, like a nightmare come to life, like every dark fairy tale Brielle's father had whispered to her as a child. He was tall, impossibly tall, at least 6.5 feet of pure muscle and power, and barely restrained violence. His broad shoulders blocked out the dying light of the afternoon sun, casting the room into shadow. His long black hair fell past his shoulders in wild waves, untamed and fierce, with small braids woven through it, each one adorned with silver rings and runes of protection and power. His beard framed a face that looked carved from granite and shadow, all sharp angles and brutal beauty, with a scar running from his left temple to his jaw, a testament to battles won and enemies vanquished. But it was his eyes that stole Brielle's breath. They were dark as midnight, black as the space between stars, and they burned with something Brielle couldn't name, something that made her heart stutter, and her wolf, dormant and silent for so long, suddenly wake and whimper. Those eyes swept across the room with the precision of a predator assessing prey, taking in the stepmother's shocked face, her mouth hanging open in a most undignified way, the stepsister's expressions frozen between fear and fascination, the opulent furniture that seemed obscene in its excess while Brielle knelt on the floor in rags, the bucket of spilled water spreading across the warped floorboards. And then those eyes found her. The world tilted. Time slowed. The air itself seemed to crystallize, every molecule suspended in this single, eternal moment. Brielle was on her knees in a soaked red dress, her white hair a tangled mess that hung like a veil around her face, her hands bleeding onto the wet floor, her body trembling with exhaustion and cold and something else, something that ignited in her chest the moment his gaze locked onto hers. She couldn't breathe, couldn't move, couldn't think, couldn't look away. His pupils dilated, his nostrils flared, his entire body went rigid, every muscle tensing as if struck by lightning. And in that moment, Brielle saw something flash across his face, something raw and primal and overwhelming. Recognition, possession, claim. The Alpha King had arrived, and everything was about to change. Igor Grimwolf had not planned to stop in this forgotten corner of his territory. He had been returning from the northern borders, where rogue wolves had been threatening his people, where he had spent 3 weeks hunting down the perpetrators and reminding them with fang and fury why he was called the Grimwolf, why his name was whispered in fear across every pack in the realm, why even the bravest alphas submitted when he entered a room. He was a king forged in battle, born in blood, raised on violence and loss, a leader who showed no mercy to his enemies, whose very presence made grown wolves submit and tremble, whose reputation preceded him like a shadow made of nightmares. He had killed his first rogue at 14, had challenged and defeated his predecessor at 21, when the old king had grown weak and corrupt, more interested in gold than in protecting his people. Igor had torn out his throat in front of the entire court, had stood covered in blood, and declared himself king, daring anyone to challenge him. No one had. For 10 years, he had ruled with an iron fist, crushing rebellions before they could start, forming alliances through strength rather than diplomacy, expanding his territory until his kingdom was the largest and most powerful in the known world. He had everything: power, wealth, respect born of fear, armies that would die at his command, a palace that rivaled the old kingdoms of legend. And he had nothing. No family, no friends, no one who saw him as anything other than the ruthless king who could end their lives with a single command. He was surrounded by people, and utterly, devastatingly alone. He had accepted this, had made peace with the fact that he would rule alone and die alone and be remembered only as the Grim Wolf, the Alpha King who conquered but never loved. His wolf had been silent for years, content to prowl the edges of his consciousness, emerging only for battle, for the hunt, for the rare moments when he let himself shift and run beneath the moon, trying to outrun the emptiness that gnawed at his soul. But on this particular afternoon, as his horse carried him past a small, decrepit cabin on the edge of nowhere, he had heard something. A voice. Not loud, but breaking. A sound of pain so deep it had called to something primal in him, something he had thought long buried beneath duty and violence and the loneliness of the crown. His wolf, silent for so long, had suddenly surged to the surface, snarling and clawing to get out, to investigate, to find the source of that sound. He had dismounted without thinking, his instincts screaming at him that something important was happening, that his life was about to change in ways he couldn't comprehend. He had approached the door, his hand already on the latch, his enhanced hearing picking up the words being spoken inside. Worthless creature. Sleep with the dogs. Use the brush, not the cloth. I want to see your knees bleed. The words had ignited something in him, something volcanic and terrifying. Rage had filled him, white-hot and absolute, more intense than anything he had felt in battle, more consuming than anything he had experienced in his 31 years of life. His wolf had been roaring, demanding he protect, defend, claim. And then he had opened the door and seen her. The Omega on the floor, white hair like moonlight, like the first snow of winter, like starlight made tangible. Skin pale as alabaster, so translucent he could see the blue veins beneath, delicate as porcelain and just as fragile. Eyes the color of a storm-torn sky, gray and silver and infinite, wide and haunted, and achingly, devastatingly beautiful. A red dress clinging to a body too thin, too fragile, too hurt. The fabric torn and soaked and clinging to curves that spoke of a woman who had been denied food, denied care, denied everything she deserved. Hands bleeding, knees pressed against wet wood, hair falling like a curtain around a face that was equal parts sorrow and resilience. And in that moment, in that single eternal heartbeat, Igor Grimwolf felt something he had never felt before, something that defied logic and reason and every law of nature he understood. Recognition. Not of her face, not of her name, not of any memory or encounter, but of her soul. His wolf roared inside him, a sound of claim and possession and desperate, overwhelming need that drowned out every other thought, every other sensation. Mine. The word echoed through every fiber of his being, through every cell and sinew, through the very marrow of his bones. Mine, 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 mate. The realization hit him like a physical blow, stealing his breath, making his heart stutter and then race, making his hands tremble with the need to touch, to protect, to claim. This broken, beautiful Omega kneeling on the floor was his mate, his true mate, the other half of his soul, the one person in all the world who was meant for him, and him alone. He had heard of true mates, of course. Every wolf grew up hearing the legends, the stories of bonds so strong they transcended death, of loves so powerful they could change the course of kingdoms. But he had never believed it would happen to him. He was too dark, too violent, too stained with blood to deserve something so pure. And yet here she was, his mate, looking at him with those storm cloud eyes, trembling and afraid and perfect. "Who are you?" The stepmother's voice was shrill, frightened, but trying desperately to maintain some semblance of authority. "How dare you barge into my home without permission? Do you know who I am?" The Alpha King did not spare her a glance. His eyes remained fixed on Brielle, as if she were the only thing in the room, in the world, that mattered. He crossed the room in 3 long strides, each step deliberate and purposeful, his boots heavy on the wooden floor, and dropped to one knee beside Brielle. The movement was fluid, graceful despite his size, and it brought him to eye level with her. Up close, Brielle could see everything. The scar on his face, silver against tanned skin, the result of claws raking across his features in some long-ago battle. The flecks of gold in his dark eyes, like stars hidden in a night sky. The way his jaw clenched, as if he were holding back words, emotions, instincts that threatened to overwhelm him. The faint scent of leather and pine, and something uniquely him, masculine and intoxicating and utterly overwhelming to her senses. She could see the bruises on her arms, the cuts on her hands, the exhaustion etched into her delicate features, and something in his chest cracked open, something he had kept locked away for so long he had forgotten it existed. Compassion. Tenderness. A need to protect so fierce it bordered on madness. "What is your name?" His voice was low, rough, the voice of a man who commanded armies and conquered kingdoms. But there was a gentleness to it, a careful softness that shocked even him as it emerged from his throat. He was terrified of frightening her, of making her flinch, of adding to the pain he could see etched into every line of her body. Brielle stared at him, unable to form words. Her mind was spinning, trying to understand what was happening. Why the Alpha King, the most powerful and feared wolf in the realm, was kneeling beside her in a dirty cabin on the edge of nowhere. This close, he was overwhelming in ways she couldn't articulate. He smelled like the forest after rain, like danger and safety all at once, like home and adventure and everything she had ever been denied. His presence was a weight and a warmth, pressing against her, wrapping around her, making her feel seen for the first time in years, in forever. Her lips parted, but no sound emerged. She was trembling, her entire body shaking with cold and shock, and something else. Something that felt like recognition. Like her soul knew him, even though her mind didn't understand how that was possible. "It's all right," he murmured, his voice dropping even lower, becoming almost hypnotic in its gentleness. "You're safe now. I promise you. You're safe. No one will ever hurt you again. Just tell me your name." "Brielle," she finally whispered, her voice hoarse from disuse, from all the words she had swallowed over the years. "Brielle Wolfsong. Brielle." He repeated her name like a prayer, like a vow, like the most sacred word he had ever spoken. His hand, large and calloused and scarred from countless battles, reached out slowly, carefully, as if she were made of glass and might shatter at the slightest touch. When his fingers brushed her cheek, she gasped, the sound sharp and startled in the tense silence of the room. The touch was feather-light, reverent, and it sent heat flooding through her cold, aching body, chasing away the numbness that had settled into her bones. "Your Majesty." The stepmother had found her voice again, false and fawning, dripping with a deference that made Igor's lip curl in disgust. "We had no idea you would honor us with your presence. We would have prepared, would have made arrangements. This girl, she's just a servant, a nobody, an orphan we took in out of the goodness of our hearts. If she has offended you in some way, if she has done something to displease your Majesty, please know that we will discipline her appropriately. We can have her removed from your sight immediately." Silence. The word was a growl, a command that made the walls tremble and the fire in the hearth flare and die. Igor's eyes remained on Brielle, but the temperature in the room had dropped even further, frost forming on the windows, spreading in intricate patterns that looked like claws. The air crackled with barely contained fury, with power so immense it made the floorboards creak and groan. The Alpha King's wolf was very close to the surface now, gold bleeding into the black of his eyes, a sign that he was seconds away from shifting, from tearing apart everything and everyone in this room except for the woman before him. "This woman," he said softly, dangerously, each word enunciated with terrifying precision, "is no servant. She is no nobody. And if I hear you call her such again, I will remove your tongue from your head. Do you understand me?" The stepmother made a strangled sound, her face going pale. "Yes, Your Majesty," she gasped. "I apologize. I meant no offense." Igor finally turned to look at her, and the full force of his gaze, cold and merciless and utterly devoid of compassion, made her take a step back. "You took her in out of goodness?" he asked, his voice deceptively calm. "Then why are her hands bleeding? Why is she on her knees scrubbing floors while you sit by the fire in fine clothes? Why does she look like she hasn't had a proper meal in months while you and your daughters are well fed?" The stepmother opened her mouth, then closed it, no answer forthcoming that wouldn't damn her further. Igor rose to his feet, pulling Brielle up with him, his arm wrapping around her waist to steady her trembling legs. She swayed against him, her body weak from exhaustion and hunger, and he held her close, his other hand coming up to cradle the back of her head, pressing her face against his chest. She fit perfectly against him, as if she had been made to be held by him, protected by him, cherished by him. "She is Brielle Wolfsong," he announced, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority, of a king who expected to be obeyed without question. "And she will be coming with me." The cabin erupted in protests and shrieks, the stepmother and her daughters suddenly finding their voices, objecting and arguing and claiming rights they didn't have. But Igor did not listen. He swept Brielle into his arms as if she weighed nothing, as if she were the most precious thing in the world, cradling her against his broad chest, and carried her out into the fading light of the afternoon, leaving chaos and confusion in his wake. "Wait," Brielle breathed against his chest, her voice barely audible, her small hands clutching at the fur of his cloak. "I don't understand. Why are you doing this? You don't know me. You don't owe me anything. I'm nobody." Igor stopped walking, standing perfectly still in the middle of the road, his arms tightening around her. He looked down at her, and for the first time in a decade, he smiled. Not the cold, cruel smile he gave his enemies, not the political smile he wore at court, but something real, something warm, something that made him look almost human, almost vulnerable, almost young. "You are not nobody," he said, his voice fierce and tender all at once. "You are Brielle Wolfsong. You are beautiful and brave, and you survived years of cruelty that would have broken lesser souls. And you are mine." The last word came out as a growl, possessive and absolute. His eyes had gone completely gold now, his wolf so close to the surface that Brielle could feel the power radiating from him, could sense the barely leashed violence that thrummed beneath his skin. "Yours?" Brielle repeated, confused and frightened, and oddly thrilled by the intensity of his gaze. "What do you mean?" Igor's jaw clenched. He wanted to tell her, wanted to explain the mate bond, wanted to lay bare his soul and confess that she was his true mate, the other half of his existence, the one thing he had been searching for his entire life without even knowing it. But she had been through so much already. She was fragile, broken, barely holding herself together. To thrust this on her now, to demand she accept a bond she didn't understand with a man she had just met, felt cruel. So instead he simply said, "Because you need someone to protect you. And I need to protect you. I can't explain it, Brielle. I don't fully understand it myself. But the moment I saw you, something in me knew that I couldn't leave you there. Knew that I would tear apart anyone who tried to hurt you. Knew that you belong with me." Brielle stared up at him, her storm-gray eyes searching his face for deception, for cruelty, for the catch that had to be coming. But all she saw was sincerity. Raw, unfiltered, almost painful sincerity. "I don't know you," she whispered, but her hands were still clutching his cloak, still holding on as if he were a lifeline in a raging sea. "Then let me give you the chance to know me," Igor replied. "Come with me to the palace. Let me care for you, protect you, show you what it means to be cherished instead of broken. And if, after time has passed and you have healed, you decide you want to leave, I will not stop you. I will give you money, land, whatever you need to build a new life. But please, Brielle, please don't ask me to take you back there. Don't ask me to leave you in that place." His voice cracked on the last word, and Brielle realized with shock that this powerful, terrifying king was begging her. Actually begging. As if her answer mattered more than anything else in the world. She thought of the cabin, the cold, the hunger, the endless labor and cruelty and loneliness. She thought of her father's grave, overgrown and forgotten in the small cemetery at the edge of the village. She thought of the girl she used to be, before the darkness came, before she learned to make herself small and invisible. And then she looked at Igor, at the man holding her as if she were made of spun glass and starlight, and made a decision that would change the course of her life forever. "Okay," she breathed. "I'll come with you." The journey to the palace took 3 days. 3 days that felt like a dream to Brielle, like she had stepped through some invisible veil into another world entirely. Igor refused to let her ride alone. She sat before him on his massive black stallion, a beast of an animal that should have terrified her but seemed oddly gentle when she was near, wrapped in Igor's fur cloak that smelled of him and kept her warmer than anything she had worn in years. His arms were a cage of safety around her, holding the reins, holding her, keeping her steady as the horse ate up mile after mile of road. She should have been afraid, should have been terrified of this stranger who had swept into her life and turned everything upside down. But instead, she felt safe, protected. For the first time since her father died, she felt like maybe, just maybe, everything was going to be okay. At night, they camped under the stars, and Igor built fires that roared with heat while she slept, standing guard over her like a sentinel, his eyes scanning the darkness for any threat. He refused to sleep, refused to let his guard down for even a moment. Twice. He left the camp to deal with rogues who had picked up their scent and thought to investigate. Both times, he returned with blood on his hands and death in his eyes. The brutal alpha king who showed no mercy to those who threatened what was his. But the moment he saw Brielle, the moment she looked at him with concern and fear, his expression softened, became almost tender. "I'm all right," he would say, washing the blood from his hands in a nearby stream. "They won't bother us again." Brielle learned quickly that there were 2 sides to Igor Grimwolf. There was the king, cold and ruthless and absolutely terrifying, who could kill without hesitation and rule without compassion. And then there was the man who looked at her like she hung the moon, who spoke to her in gentle tones, who treated her as if she were the most precious thing in existence. She did not understand him. This duality confused her, frightened her sometimes, but also fascinated her in ways she couldn't articulate. How could someone so brutal be so tender? How could someone so feared be so careful? On the second night, as she sat by the fire wrapped in his cloak, Igor approached with a plate of food. Roasted rabbit, bread, cheese, things she hadn't eaten in so long her stomach cramped at the sight. "Eat," he said softly, settling beside her, close enough that she could feel the heat of his body. "You need to regain your strength." Brielle took the plate with trembling hands, but when she tried to eat, her stomach rebelled, unused to rich food after months of scraps. She managed a few bites before setting it aside, tears of frustration pricking her eyes. I'm sorry, she whispered. I want to eat. I can't. Igor's expression gentled. It's all right, he said, moving the plate away. Your body needs time to adjust. We'll start small, a little at a time. He disappeared into his pack and returned with dried fruit, something easier to digest. He held out a piece of apple, and when she reached for it, he pulled it back slightly. Let me, he said, his voice rough with emotion he couldn't quite name. Brielle's eyes widened, but she nodded, parting her lips. Igor fed her the piece of fruit, his fingers lingering at her lips, his touch gentle and reverent. They stayed like that, him feeding her small bites, her accepting them, an intimacy forming between them that had nothing to do with desire and everything to do with trust, with care, with the slow building of something profound. Tell me about yourself, Igor said after a while, his voice soft in the darkness. Tell me about your father. Brielle looked at him, surprised. My father? She repeated. I want to know everything about you, he explained, his dark eyes reflecting the firelight, everything that made you who you are. And so Brielle talked. Hesitantly at first, then with growing confidence as Igor listened with complete attention, never interrupting, never judging. She told him about her father, about how he had been a kind man, a gentle alpha who had lost his mate when Brielle was born and raised her alone with fierce devotion. She told him about the stories he used to tell, about wolves who ran with the stars, about loves that transcended death, about bonds that nothing could break. He called me his little moon, she said, her voice breaking slightly. Because of my white hair. He said I glowed in the darkness. You do, Igor said quietly. You do glow, Brielle. Like moonlight. Like hope. She looked at him, and in the firelight, she could see the sincerity in his expression, the way he looked at her as if she were something miraculous. What about you? She asked, emboldened by his openness. Tell me about yourself. How did you become king? Igor's expression darkened, shadows passing across his features. My story is not a happy one, he warned. Neither is mine, Brielle replied. But you listen to me. Let me listen to you. And so Igor talked. He told her about his childhood, about how he had been born into a lesser pack, his parents killed by rogues when he was young. He told her about the years of training, of fighting, of clawing his way up through sheer strength and determination. He told her about challenging the old king, about the battle that had lasted for hours and left him scarred and bloodied but victorious. He told her about the loneliness of the crown, about ruling a kingdom while feeling utterly, devastatingly alone. I have everything, he said, staring into the flames. Power, wealth, respect. And yet I wake up every morning feeling empty, feeling like there's something missing, some fundamental piece of myself that I can't find. He turned to look at her, his eyes intense. Until I saw you. And then suddenly, for the first time in years, I felt complete. Brielle's breath caught. She didn't know what to say, how to respond to such a raw confession. So instead, she did something brave, something she hadn't done in years. She reached out and took his hand, her small fingers interlacing with his larger ones. Thank you, she whispered, for saving me, for seeing me when everyone else looked through me. Igor brought her hand to his lips and kissed her knuckles, the gesture achingly gentle. Thank you for letting me save you, he replied. They sat like that until the fire burned low and the stars wheeled overhead, hands joined, two broken souls finding something like peace in each other's presence. Why me? She asked one night, during their final evening on the road, staring into the flames that danced and crackled, casting flickering shadows across both their faces. You could have any woman in the kingdom. Noble women, alphas, women who are strong and beautiful and worthy of a king. Why would you want someone like me? Someone broken and damaged and nothing? The words tasted like ash in her mouth, all the old insecurities rising up, all the poison her step-family had poured into her ears for years, manifesting in this moment of vulnerability. Igor was silent for a long moment, his jaw clenching, his hands curling into fists, as if he wanted to find everyone who had ever made her feel this way and tear them apart. Then he reached out and tucked a strand of white hair behind her ear, his touch lingering, his calloused fingers tracing the curve of her jaw with devastating gentleness. Because I have spent my life surrounded by people who want my power, my title, my crown, he said quietly, his voice rough with emotion. They see the Alpha King, the conqueror, the weapon. They fear me, or they want to use me, but none of them see me. The man beneath the crown, the soul beneath the strength. But you, Brielle, when you look at me, you don't see any of that. You see the man who sits beside you. You see the person behind the title. And when I look at you, I don't see weakness, or brokenness, or damage. I see strength. I see survival. I see a woman who endured hell and came out with her kindness intact, with her softness preserved. Do you know how rare that is? Do you know how precious? Her breath caught, tears spilling down her cheeks, each word landing like a benediction on wounds she hadn't known how badly needed healing. You could have bent, he continued, his thumb wiping away her tears with infinite care. You could have become cruel like them, could have let the darkness consume you. But you didn't. You survived, and you remained good. That takes more strength than any battle I've ever fought, more courage than any war I've ever won. And that, Brielle, that is why I want you. Because you are extraordinary. Because you are a queen in every way that matters. I'm not a queen, Brielle whispered, but her voice was less certain now, less convinced of her own inadequacy. I'm just an Omega who— You are everything, Igor interrupted, his voice fierce, his eyes blazing with conviction that burned away every doubt. And I will spend the rest of my life proving that to you. Every single day, I will show you what I see when I look at you. I will show you your own worth reflected in my eyes until you believe it yourself. Brielle couldn't speak, couldn't breathe, couldn't do anything but stare at this impossible man who spoke impossible words that reached into the darkest corners of her soul and lit them on fire. I'm afraid, she finally admitted, her voice breaking. I'm afraid this is a dream. That I'll wake up back in that cabin, on my knees, scrubbing floors. I'm afraid that you'll realize I'm not who you think I am and you'll send me away. Igor pulled her close, wrapping his arms around her, cradling her against his chest where she could hear the steady thunder of his heartbeat. Never, he vowed, his voice a low rumble that she felt as much as heard. I will never send you away. And this is not a dream, Brielle. This is real. I am real. And what I feel for you is more real than anything I have ever known. What do you feel for me? She asked, her lips moving against the fabric of his shirt. Igor hesitated. The truth was on his tongue, the confession that she was his mate, his true mate, the other half of his soul. But he swallowed it down, knowing it was too soon, knowing she wasn't ready to understand the depth and permanence of what bound them together. I feel like I've been searching for you my entire life, he said instead, which was true enough. I feel like every battle I fought, every challenge I overcame, was leading me to that moment when I opened that door and saw you. I feel like you are the answer to a question I didn't know I was asking. Brielle's heart stuttered in her chest, hope and fear, and something that felt dangerously close to love blooming in equal measure. I feel it too, she whispered. This connection, like I know you even though I just met you, like my soul recognizes yours. Igor's arms tightened around her, his face buried in her white hair, breathing in her scent of wildflowers and rain. Because it does, he said softly, Because we are meant for each other, Brielle. I know you're not ready to hear it, not ready to understand what that means. But someday, when you're healed and whole and strong, I will tell you everything. And I hope, with everything in me, that you will choose me the way I have already chosen you. They stayed like that, wrapped in each other, until the fire died to embers and the sky began to lighten with the promise of dawn. Neither of them willing to let go, both of them holding on to this fragile, beautiful thing growing between them. The palace was a fortress of stone and silver, perched on a mountainside like a crown on the head of the world. When they arrived, the entire court gathered to witness the Alpha King's return. Whispers rippled through the crowd as Igor dismounted and lifted Brielle down, his hands lingering on her waist. "This is Brielle Wolfsong," he announced, his voice carrying across the courtyard. "She is under my protection. Anyone who disrespects her disrespects me." The message was clear. The threat was implicit. And the court bowed. But not everyone was pleased. Igor's advisor, a thin man named Corvus, with eyes like a snake, approached him in the throne room later that evening. "Your Majesty," he said carefully, "the court is concerned. An Omega from nowhere, with no family, no connections. Surely you cannot mean to—" "I mean to do exactly as I please," Igor said coldly. His voice had changed. This was the king the world feared, the wolf who tore apart his enemies without hesitation. "Do you have a problem with that, Corvus?" The advisor paled. "No, Your Majesty. Of course not." "Good. Then spread the word. Brielle Wolfsong is to be treated with the utmost respect. She will want for nothing. And if I hear of anyone causing her even a moment of discomfort, I will deal with them personally." The threat hung in the air like a blade. Corvus bowed and fled. Alone in the throne room, Igor let out a long breath. His wolf was restless, pacing, demanding he go to her, ensure she was safe, comfortable, happy. It was maddening, this need, this obsession. He had ruled for 10 years without feeling anything beyond duty and rage, and now, because of one white-haired Omega with storm-cloud eyes, he was unraveling. He found her in the chambers he had prepared for her, standing by the window, staring out at the mountains. She was wearing a new dress, soft and silver, and her white hair had been washed and brushed until it gleamed. She looked like moonlight given form. "Brielle," he said softly. She turned, and he saw tears on her cheeks. "Your Majesty," she whispered. "Igor. I don't belong here. Everyone knows it. I can feel them staring, judging. I'm not a queen. I'm not even a proper lady. I'm just... Come here." It wasn't a command. It was a plea. And she went to him, crossing the room on trembling legs until she stood before him. He cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs wiping away her tears. "Listen to me," he said, his voice low and intense. "I don't care what anyone thinks. I don't care about bloodlines or titles or any of the nonsense they use to measure worth. You survived years of cruelty and pain, and you are still kind. You are still soft. That is strength, Brielle. That is power. And that is why you belong here. With me." She looked up at him, her eyes searching his face. "Do you truly believe that?" "I know it," he said. "And I will prove it to you. Every day. For the rest of our lives." And then, slowly, carefully, as if she might disappear if he moved too quickly, he lowered his head and kissed her. It was gentle, reverent, a kiss that tasted of promises and hope, and something neither of them had felt in so long it hurt. When he pulled back, Brielle was crying again, but this time, she was smiling. The weeks that followed were a dream Brielle feared she would wake from. Igor kept his promise. He was fierce and terrifying to the world, the Alpha King who crushed rebellions and commanded armies with an iron fist. But with her, He was different. He brought her breakfast in bed, read to her by the fire, took her on walks through the palace gardens where winter roses bloomed. He was patient with her fears, her insecurities, the way she flinched when servants entered the room too quickly. He fired anyone who looked at her with disdain and rewarded those who showed her kindness. He taught her to read maps and play chess, delighting in her sharp mind and quick wit. And at night, he held her, his body a wall between her and the nightmares that still haunted her. But the court was not so easily won. There were whispers in the corridors, rumors that Brielle had bewitched the king, that she was using dark magic to control him. Some said she was a spy from a rival pack. Others claimed she was a curse, a bad omen that would bring ruin to the kingdom. Brielle tried to ignore them. But one evening, as she walked through the palace, she overheard a group of noblewomen talking in a side chamber. "She's pathetic," one of them sneered, "clinging to the king like a lost puppy. He'll tire of her soon enough. I heard she was a servant before this. Can you imagine? An Omega serving her own family. How low. She'll never be a true queen. She doesn't have the breeding, the education, the strength. She's just a pretty distraction." Brielle's heart twisted. She turned and fled, tears streaming down her face, until she found herself in the library, the one place where she felt safe. She sank into a chair by the fire and wept, all the old doubts and fears rising up to choke her. That was where Igor found her. He had been in a council meeting when one of the servants, a young girl named Mira, who had taken a liking to Brielle, burst in and whispered that something was wrong. Igor had left immediately, his wolf snarling, sensing his mate's distress. When he saw her crying, something in him snapped. "Who hurt you?" His voice was a growl, deadly and cold. "Tell me, Brielle. I will tear them apart." She looked up at him, her face pale, her eyes red. "They're right," she whispered. "I don't belong here. I'm not strong enough, not good enough. I'll never be what you need." Igor knelt before her, his hands gripping the arms of her chair, his face inches from hers. His eyes were blazing, his wolf so close to the surface she could see gold flecks in the darkness. "You are everything I need," he said, his voice shaking with emotion. "You are the only thing I need, and anyone who made you feel otherwise will answer to me." "Igor, please, no." He stood, his entire body radiating fury. "This ends tonight." He stormed out of the library and Brielle followed, her heart pounding. Igor strode through the palace with purpose, his presence so commanding that courtiers scattered before him. He reached the great hall and threw open the doors. "Everyone. Here. Now." It was a command that could not be ignored. Within minutes, the hall was filled with nobles, advisors, servants, guards. The entire court assembled, confused and frightened, as the Alpha King stood before them, a force of nature barely contained. "Let me make something very clear," Igor said, his voice echoing off the stone walls, carrying to every corner of the vast hall, reaching every ear. His presence was overwhelming, commanding absolute attention without effort. The Alpha King stood before his people, power radiating from him in waves that made the air itself feel heavy. "Brielle Wolfsong is mine. She is my chosen mate, my queen in all but name, and she stands under my personal protection. Anyone who disrespects her, anyone who speaks ill of her, anyone who causes her even a moment of discomfort, will not receive a trial, will not receive mercy, will answer directly to me." He let the silence stretch, let the weight of his words settle over the assembled court like a heavy blanket. His eyes swept over the crowd, meeting the gaze of nobles and servants alike, making sure every single person understood the gravity of what he was saying. "I have ruled this kingdom for 10 years, he continued, his voice dropping lower but losing none of its intensity. "I have defended you from enemies, both external and internal. I have expanded our borders, secured our wealth, made us the most powerful pack in the known world. I have bled for you, killed for you, asked for nothing in return but your loyalty and obedience. And now I am telling you, this woman is more important to me than any of you, more important than this crown, more important than this throne. If you force me to choose between her and this kingdom, I will choose her. Every single time. The court erupted in shocked murmurs, gasps of disbelief. No one had ever heard their king speak this way, with such raw emotion, such vulnerability disguised as threat. It was terrifying and awe-inspiring in equal measure. Igor's gaze found the noble women who had spoken cruelly of Brielle, and they paled, shrinking back as if they could disappear into the stone walls. His eyes had gone completely gold, his wolf so close to the surface that the temperature in the hall dropped, frost forming on the windows, everyone's breath visible in the suddenly frigid air. You, he said, pointing at the 3 women who had mocked Brielle in the corridors. Come here. Now. They hesitated, looking at each other with wide, terrified eyes. Igor's expression didn't change, but the air crackled with barely leashed violence, with the promise of pain if they did not obey immediately. I will not ask again, he said softly, and something in his tone made it clear that the next words out of his mouth would not be a request, but a command backed by claws and fangs. The women stumbled forward, their expensive gowns rustling, their faces painted masks of fear. They reached the base of the dais where Igor stood, and he descended the steps slowly, deliberately, each footfall echoing like a death knell. On your knees, he commanded. They dropped immediately, their legs giving out, trembling so hard their jewelry rattled. One of them was crying, mascara running down her face in black rivulets. Now, Igor said, his voice cold enough to freeze blood, you will apologize to Brielle. You will tell her exactly what you said about her, and then you will beg her forgiveness. And if your apology is not sincere, if I sense even the slightest hint of mockery or condescension, I will ensure that you never speak again. Do I make myself clear? Yes, Your Majesty. They gasped in unison, the words tumbling over each other in their haste. Brielle watched from the doorway, her heart pounding, her hands trembling. She had never seen anything like this, had never imagined that someone would defend her this way, would put their reputation and authority on the line for her. It was overwhelming, terrifying, and deeply, profoundly moving. The first woman turned to face Brielle, still on her knees, tears streaming down her face. Miss Wolfsong, she said, her voice shaking. I said terrible things about you. I called you pathetic. I said you were clinging to the king, that he would tire of you. I said you could never be a true queen because you didn't have the breeding or education or strength. I was wrong, so wrong. I spoke out of jealousy and cruelty, and I beg your forgiveness. The second and third women followed suit, each confession more abject than the last, each plea more desperate. When they finished, they remained on their knees, heads bowed, waiting for judgment. Brielle stood frozen, unsure what to say, what to do. She looked at Igor, and he gave her the slightest nod, as if to say the choice was hers, the power was hers. She could demand retribution or offer mercy, and he would support whatever she decided. She took a deep breath and stepped forward. Her red dress, now replaced with a proper gown Igor had procured during their journey, swishing softly against the stone floor. When she reached the women, she knelt down, bringing herself to their level, surprising everyone in the hall. I forgive you, she said softly, but her voice carried in the silence. Not because what you said didn't hurt. It did. But because I know what it's like to be judged unfairly, to be dismissed and diminished. And I won't perpetuate that cycle. I won't become what hurt me. The women stared at her in shock, and then, one by one, they began to sob, not tears of fear but of genuine remorse and relief. Brielle stood and returned to Igor's side, and he looked at her with such pride, such admiration, that she felt like she truly could be the queen he believed her to be. When the apologies were given and the women had fled, still crying, Igor dismissed the court with a wave of his hand. The hall emptied quickly, nobles and servants alike scurrying away, whispers following them like shadows. But before everyone could leave, Igor raised his voice one final time. Let this be a lesson to all of you. Strength is not just in claws and fangs. It is not just in dominance and fear. True strength is in compassion, in mercy, in choosing kindness when cruelty would be easier. Brielle Wolfsong has shown more strength in this moment than most of you will show in your lifetimes. Remember that. Remember her. And know that she is exactly the kind of queen this kingdom needs. Alone in the throne room, Igor turned to find Brielle, her eyes shining with unshed tears, her expression a mixture of gratitude and disbelief. You didn't have to do that, she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. You didn't have to humiliate them for me. Yes, Igor said, crossing to her in long strides, pulling her into his arms. I did. Because no one will ever hurt you again. Not while I draw breath. He pulled back just enough to look at her, his hands framing her face, his thumbs brushing away the tears that finally spilled over. You are under my protection, Brielle. Now and always. And I need you to understand what that means. It means I will go to war for you. I will burn kingdoms for you. I will destroy anyone and anything that threatens you. Not because you are weak and need protecting, but because you are precious and deserve to be cherished. Brielle's breath hitched, her heart swelling with an emotion too big to name. I think I'm falling in love with you, she said softly, the words escaping before she could stop them. Honest and vulnerable and terrifying. Igor's expression transformed, every hard line softening, his eyes going impossibly tender. I fell in love with you the moment I saw you, Brielle, when you were on your knees in that cabin, looking broken but not defeated, hurt but not destroyed. I saw you, truly saw you, and my soul recognized its mate, and I have been falling deeper ever since. I will love you until the stars burn out and the world ends, and even beyond that, into whatever comes next. And then he kissed her, right there in the throne room, his hands tangling in her white hair, her body pressed against his, and it felt like coming home, like every piece of her that had been scattered and broken was suddenly whole again. The months that followed were the happiest of Brielle's life. The court, cowed by Igor's display of dominance, began to treat her with respect, and some even with genuine warmth. She formed friendships with other Omegas in the palace, women who saw her not as a threat, but as one of their own. She studied history and politics with Igor's advisors, surprising everyone with her sharp mind and thoughtful insights. And with Igor, she blossomed. He courted her with a patience and devotion that made her heart sing. He took her to the highest peaks of the mountains to watch the sunrise. He danced with her in empty ballrooms under chandeliers of crystal and starlight. He whispered poetry in her ear and made her laugh until her sides ached. But he also showed her his world, the duties of a king, the weight of the crown, the endless decisions that meant life or death for his people. He included her in council meetings, asked for her opinion, valued her perspective. And slowly, she began to see herself as he saw her, not as a broken Omega, but as a woman of strength and wisdom. One night, as they stood on the balcony of his chambers, looking out at the kingdom spread below them like a sea of lights, Igor turned to her. Brielle, he said, his voice serious. There is something I must tell you. She looked up at him, concern flickering in her eyes. What is it? He took her hands in his thumb tracing circles on her palm. When I first saw you, I felt something I had never felt before. A bond. The mate bond. Brielle's breath caught, She had heard of the mate bond, the sacred connection between wolves that transcended reason or choice. But she had never believed it could happen to someone like her. "You're my true mate," Igor continued, his eyes searching hers. "I knew it the moment I saw you. My wolf recognized you, claimed you, and I have been waiting, hoping, that one day you might feel the same." Tears spilled down Brielle's cheeks. "I do," she whispered. "I feel it, Igor. This pull, this connection. It's like you're a part of me. Like I've been searching for you my whole life and didn't even know it." Relief and joy flooded Igor's face. "Then marry me," he said, dropping to one knee before her. "Be my queen, Brielle. Not just in name, but in truth. Rule beside me. Build a life with me. Let me love you for the rest of our days." Brielle didn't hesitate. "Yes," she said, laughing and crying at once. "Yes, Igor. 1,000 times. Yes." He stood and swept her into his arms, kissing her with a passion that made the stars above them blaze brighter. And in that moment, Brielle knew she was finally home. The wedding was a spectacle that would be remembered for generations. The great hall was transformed into a winter wonderland, with ice sculptures and garlands of silver and blue. Wolves from every pack in the realm came to witness the union of their king and his Omega Queen, and the air hummed with magic and music. Brielle walked down the aisle in a gown of white and silver, her hair crowned with winter roses, her hand in Igor's. She looked radiant, ethereal, every inch the queen she was meant to be, and when Igor lifted her veil and kissed her, the entire hall erupted in cheers and howls of approval. But not everyone was celebrating. Corvus, the king's advisor, watched from the shadows, his face twisted with rage and envy. He had been planning for years to take the throne, to manipulate Igor into a political marriage that would give Corvus power and influence. But Brielle had ruined everything. She had made the king soft, distracted, vulnerable. And Corvus intended to use that vulnerability to destroy them both. The first sign of trouble came a week after the wedding. Reports arrived of attacks on the kingdom's borders, coordinated strikes that bore the mark of a trained military force. Igor assembled his generals and rode out to investigate, leaving Brielle in the palace under heavy guard. But the attacks were a diversion. One night, as Brielle slept, a figure slipped into her chambers. Corvus stood over her, a blade gleaming in his hand, his eyes cold and merciless. He raised the weapon, prepared to strike. But Brielle's eyes snapped open. Years of survival had honed her instincts, and she rolled to the side just as the blade came down, slicing through the pillow where her head had been. She screamed, a sound of pure terror and defiance, and the guards burst into the room. Corvus fled, disappearing into the shadows, but the damage was done. News of the assassination attempt reached Igor within hours, and he rode back to the palace with a fury that shook the very ground. When he burst into Brielle's chambers and saw her pale and trembling, blood on her nightgown from a shallow cut on her arm, something inside him broke. He pulled her into his arms, his entire body shaking. "I almost lost you," he whispered, his voice raw. "I almost lost you." "I'm okay," she said, holding him tight. "I'm okay, Igor. I'm safe." But Igor was not comforted. He pulled back, his eyes blazing with gold, his wolf barely contained. "Corvus will pay for this," he growled. "I will tear him apart with my bare hands." He left her side only long enough to issue orders, to mobilize every resource at his disposal to hunt down the traitor. And within 2 days, Corvus was found, hiding in a cave on the far side of the kingdom. Igor dragged him back to the palace in chains. The trial was swift. Corvus confessed to everything, his plan to assassinate Brielle, to destabilize the kingdom, to seize the throne. The court watched in horror as the full extent of his treachery was revealed, and when the time came for sentencing, Igor rose from his throne, his face a mask of cold fury, "You tried to kill my mate," he said, his voice echoing through the hall. "You tried to take from me the one thing in this world that matters more than my crown, my kingdom, my very life. And for that, there is only one punishment." He shifted then, his body contorting, bones cracking, fur erupting from his skin. The massive black wolf that emerged was a thing of nightmares, all fangs and fury and primal power. The court gasped and backed away as the wolf stalked toward Corvus, who was screaming and pleading for mercy. But there would be no mercy. Igor's wolf tore into Corvus with a savagery that was both terrible and swift. And when it was done, when the traitor was nothing more than a memory, the wolf turned and padded over to Brielle, who stood frozen, her eyes wide. The wolf lowered its massive head and nuzzled her hand, and Brielle, without fear, reached out and stroked the soft fur, her fingers trembling. "You saved me," she whispered. "You always save me." The wolf shifted back into Igor, and he stood before her, blood on his hands, his eyes still wild. "I will always save you," he said hoarsely. "I will always protect you. You are my heart, Brielle, my soul, and I will burn the world to keep you safe." She kissed him then, tasting salt and copper and love, and the court watched as their fierce king and his gentle queen held each other like they were the only two people in the world. In the months that followed, peace returned to the kingdom. Igor ruled with Brielle at his side, and together they were unstoppable. He was the strength and the fury, the warrior who defended their people with fang and claw. She was the compassion and the wisdom, the healer who mended broken hearts and broken packs. The court came to love her, not because she was the king's mate, but because she was kind and just and brave. She established schools for Omega children, ensured that no one in the kingdom would suffer as she had suffered. She mediated disputes with patience and insight, earning the respect of even the most hardened alphas, and Igor watched her with pride and wonder, marveling at the woman she had become, the queen she always was. But the greatest miracle came on a cold winter night, when Brielle woke Igor with tears in her eyes and a trembling smile on her lips. "I'm pregnant," she whispered. Igor stared at her, stunned into silence. And then a smile broke across his face, a smile of pure, unbridled joy. He pulled her into his arms and held her close, his hand resting on her still flat stomach. "A child," he breathed. "Our child." "Are you happy?" she asked, her voice small and uncertain. "Happy?" He pulled back to look at her, his eyes shining. "Brielle, you have given me everything. You saved me from a life of loneliness and rage. You showed me what it means to love, to be loved. And now you're giving me a family. I have never been happier." She kissed him, her heart overflowing, and they stayed like that until the dawn broke, wrapped in each other's arms, dreaming of the future. The child, a daughter with white hair and her father's dark eyes, was born on the first day of spring. They named her Liana, and she was the light of their lives, a symbol of hope and renewal for the entire kingdom. Brielle often thought back to that day in the cabin, when she had been on her knees in a soaked red dress, believing she was worthless, believing she had no future. And then Igor had walked through that door, and everything had changed. He had seen her, truly seen her. Not as a servant or a burden, but as a queen. And in seeing her, he had given her the courage to see herself. Years passed. The kingdom flourished. Igor remained the fierce alpha king, feared and respected by all. But to Brielle, he was simply Igor, the man who brought her tea in the mornings and read to their daughter at night, the man who still looked at her like she was the most precious thing in the world. And Brielle, the Omega who had once been forced to serve, became the queen she was always meant to be, beloved by her people, cherished by her mate, and finally free. On a warm summer evening, as they stood on the balcony of their chambers, watching Liana play in the gardens below, Igor turned to Brielle and took her hand. Do you ever regret it? He asked softly. Leaving your old life behind? Brielle looked up at him, her storm cloud eyes clear and bright. I don't regret a single moment, she said. That life was a prison. You set me free. No, Igor said, pulling her close. You set yourself free. I just gave you the key. She smiled and rested her head on his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. And as the sun set over the kingdom, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Brielle felt a profound sense of peace. She had been broken, but she had healed. She had been lost, but she had been found. She had been a servant, but she had become a queen. And most importantly, she had been loved. Truly, deeply, unconditionally loved. And that, she knew, was the greatest gift of all. We'd love to hear your thoughts on this beautiful love story. Let us know what you thought of this tale full of emotions and surprises. Tell us your name, where you're watching from, and rate this story from 0 to 10 if it touched your heart. And if you enjoyed the plot, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the amazing new stories coming soon. See you next time.